His mother kicked her out on a Tuesday, but the billionaire waited until their anniversary to serve the divorce papers, not because he lacked courage, but because he wanted maximum cruelty when he told his pregnant wife he was marrying his secretary instead. She stood in their penthouse holding the legal documents with one hand and cradling her 6-month belly with the other, watching him pack designer luggage for the honeymoon he had already booked with another woman, completely unaware that the wife he was discarding owned the pharmaceutical empire that had just made his family's billion-dollar company obsolete. His secretary smiled from the doorway, her diamond engagement ring catching the light, believing she'd won the ultimate prize by stealing a billionaire from his pregnant wife. But she had no idea the woman she'd replaced had been signing acquisition papers between morning sickness episodes. The anniversary card he'd given her that morning was still on the counter, unopened, unwanted, a final insult before the papers, but tucked inside his mother's handwriting revealed the truth. This hadn't been his idea alone. His mother had orchestrated the entire destruction because she'd never forgiven her daughter-in-law for being common. When the wedding invitation arrived 3 weeks later, embossed with gold lettering and his mother's family crest, it included a handwritten note from his mother. "Come see what a real woman looks like in a wedding dress, dear." The final twist of the knife from a woman who'd spent years trying to break her. His secretary had no idea she was marrying into a family that measured worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. And his mother had no idea her son was marrying down in ways she couldn't imagine. But none of them knew the pregnant ex-wife they'd humiliated was the trillionaire's daughter who'd been living undercover to test if love could survive without money. What she did when she arrived at that wedding didn't just stop the ceremony. It exposed 3 years of deception, revealed whose money had actually been funding his billionaire lifestyle, and destroyed his mother's social standing so completely that the country club would revoke her membership before the reception ended. Could a man who'd chosen his secretary over his pregnant wife ever comprehend he'd divorced the only woman who'd loved him when he had nothing? Would his mother survive the revelation that she'd been insulting the one person keeping their family fortune alive? And would his secretary stay at the altar when she discovered the billionaire she was marrying was actually bankrupt? Dear viewers, this powerful story reveals how cruelty destroys those who wield it, and why authentic love always outweighs superficial status. You'll discover that silence can be your greatest strength, that family manipulation poisons everything it touches, and that people who underestimate you often hand you the ultimate advantage. Watch how patience and dignity triumph over betrayal and cruelty. What would you have done in Elena's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have revealed your identity earlier or played the long game? Subscribe now for more captivating stories that entertain, educate, and inspire you to recognize your own worth. The penthouse smelled like vanilla cake when Elena walked through the door. But what struck her wasn't the sweetness. It was seeing her husband's secretary standing in her kitchen, wearing the apron she'd bought for their first anniversary. Amanda didn't look guilty when their eyes met across the marble island. She looked victorious, her manicured fingers resting on a stack of legal folders that didn't belong in a home where they were supposed to be celebrating 5 years of marriage. Elena's hand instinctively moved to her belly, 6 months of pregnancy making every movement deliberate. But what hurt more than the physical weight was recognizing her mother-in-law's handwriting on the documents Amanda was organizing with practiced efficiency. "He's in the bedroom," Amanda said, her voice carrying none of the professional courtesy she'd maintained during 3 years of working as Jonathan's executive assistant. But every word dripped with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment since the day she'd realized her boss's wife wore discount store dresses to company events. Elena wanted to respond with the authority of the woman who actually signed Amanda's paychecks through a web of shell corporations, but she'd spent 5 years perfecting the role of the struggling wife who'd married above her station and breaking character now would ruin everything she'd carefully built. The bedroom door was open when she reached it, and Jonathan didn't stop packing when she appeared in the doorway. He simply glanced at her belly with the expression of a man looking at a problem he was about to solve. His Hermes luggage was spread across their bed, the same bed where they'd conceived the child he now viewed as an inconvenience. But what made Elena's throat tighten wasn't the betrayal she'd been expecting for months. It was seeing him pack the watch she'd given him for their 3rd anniversary, the one she'd saved for by taking extra shifts at the hospital, where she'd been pretending to work as a nurse. "The papers are on the kitchen counter," Jonathan said, folding a cashmere sweater with the care he'd stopped showing their marriage 2 years ago. But his hands trembled slightly in a way that told Elena this wasn't as easy as he was pretending. She'd known him since college, back when he'd been a graduate student living on ramen and ambition, and she'd loved the version of him that existed before his mother's money had transformed him into someone who measured worth in stock portfolios and social connections. "Our anniversary is today," Elena said quietly, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact, watching his reflection in the mirror as he continued packing without meeting her eyes. The vanilla cake she'd spent the morning baking was still cooling in the kitchen, next to the card he'd given her at breakfast, the same card she hadn't opened because she'd recognized his mother's handwriting on the envelope and knew whatever message it contained would be designed to destroy her on a day that should have been about celebration. "That's why I chose today," Jonathan replied, and the calculated cruelty in his voice reminded Elena exactly why she'd spent 5 years documenting every manipulation, every family dinner where his mother had humiliated her in front of business partners, every moment when he'd chosen his mother's approval over his wife's dignity. He zipped the suitcase with a finality that echoed through the room, but what he didn't know was that the honeymoon he'd booked in Bali was being charged to a credit card funded by Elena's pharmaceutical empire, the same empire that had just acquired the patent rights that made his family's cosmetics company worthless. Amanda appeared in the doorway behind Elena, her presence a silent announcement that this wasn't just a conversation between husband and wife anymore. But what made Elena's stomach turn wasn't the other woman's audacity. It was seeing Jonathan's face soften when he looked at Amanda in ways it hadn't softened for Elena since before the pregnancy test had shown positive. The diamond on Amanda's finger caught the afternoon light, a 2-carat announcement of intentions that should have remained hidden until after the divorce was finalized. But Jonathan's mother had never been patient when it came to removing obstacles from her son's path. "I'm marrying Amanda in 3 weeks, Jonathan said, as if announcing a business merger rather than the destruction of a 5-year marriage. But his hand shook slightly when he picked up his suitcase, a tremor that revealed the conscience he was working hard to suppress. Elena watched him walk past her toward the door, followed by Amanda, whose perfume now filled the spaces where Elena's presence used to matter. And she said nothing because anything she revealed now would compromise the plan she'd been building since the day his mother had first called her that common girl who trapped my son. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow felt louder than slamming, and Elena stood alone in the bedroom that had witnessed both the best and worst moments of her marriage. But what Jonathan and Amanda and his mother didn't understand was that alone was exactly where she was most dangerous. She walked back to the kitchen where the divorce papers waited beside her unopened anniversary card, but she picked up her phone instead, the phone containing 3 years of recorded conversations, financial documentation, and evidence of the fraud that had kept his family's company afloat while they'd all been convinced their wealth was earned rather than sustained by the woman they were currently discarding. The vanilla cake sat abandoned on the counter, a symbol of the effort she'd wasted on a man who'd chosen his mother's approval over his wife's love but tucked beside it was the wedding invitation that had arrived yesterday, 3 weeks early, deliberately cruel, embossed with his mother's family crest, and a handwritten note that read, "Come see what a real woman looks like in a wedding dress, dear." Elena placed her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter move in response to her touch, and smiled at the irony that the child they were all rejecting would inherit an empire that made their billions look like pocket change. She opened the anniversary card then, not because she cared what it said, but because understanding the full scope of his mother's manipulation would make the eventual revelation that much more satisfying. But what she found inside wasn't Jonathan's handwriting at all. It was a note from his mother explaining exactly how she'd orchestrated the entire divorce, including the specific instructions for choosing their anniversary as the delivery date, because maximum pain ensures minimum resistance to settlement terms. Elena photographed the note with steady hands, adding it to the collection of evidence that would soon transform from private documentation into public testimony, and called her father's lawyer to confirm the final details of the acquisition that would make her the majority shareholder in Jonathan's family company before he returned from his honeymoon. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and older money when Catherine Montgomery arrived for what she believed was a routine quarterly review. But what made her pause in the doorway wasn't the unfamiliar faces seated around the conference table. It was seeing the pharmaceutical company logo projected on the screen where her family's cosmetics empire logo usually appeared. Her son Jonathan sat beside Amanda, his new fiancée, both of them dressed for the business meeting Catherine had scheduled to introduce Amanda as the future Mrs. Montgomery to the board members who would need to accept her before the wedding. But none of them noticed the woman sitting in the corner, taking notes with the quiet efficiency of someone hired to document rather than participate. "We're here to discuss the merger," Catherine announced, settling into her chair at the head of the table with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years building a cosmetics empire from her late husband's small skincare company. But what she didn't know was that the company she'd inherited was now valued at -$7 million after the patent infringements her lawyers had assured her were industry standard practice had finally caught up with her. The lawyers exchanged glances across the mahogany table, their expensive suits suddenly looking less impressive. But Catherine was too focused on Amanda's posture, perfectly straight, chin elevated, diamond ring positioned to catch the light, to notice the warning signs that her empire was about to collapse. "Mrs. Montgomery," the lead attorney began, sliding a folder across the table with hands that trembled, despite his decades of experience delivering bad news to wealthy clients. But Catherine waved him away because she'd spent the morning rehearsing the speech she planned to give about Amanda's qualifications to join the family business. Jonathan reached for Amanda's hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity that would have been romantic if either of them had understood they were holding on to each other while standing on crumbling ground. But Catherine saw only the united front she'd been orchestrating since the day she'd realized her son's pregnant wife would never be sophisticated enough for the social circles that mattered. "I've prepared a presentation about Amanda's background," Catherine continued, ignoring the attorney's attempts to interrupt. But what she failed to notice was that the woman in the corner had stopped taking notes and was now filming the entire meeting with equipment that looked far too professional for a standard corporate stenographer. The presentation Catherine had spent weeks perfecting appeared on the screen. Amanda's MBA from Columbia, her 5 years of executive experience, her family connections that would open doors. The Montgomery name alone could no longer access, but each slide was interrupted by the attorneys, increasingly desperate attempts to redirect the conversation to the actual purpose of this meeting. "Mrs. Montgomery, we need to discuss the acquisition," the attorney said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew his career depended on delivering information his client refused to hear. But Catherine's attention was fixed on Jonathan's face, as he watched Amanda's credentials appear on screen. The pride there was exactly what Catherine had been working toward since the day she'd hired Amanda as his assistant 3 years ago. What Catherine remembered was the strategic planning that had gone into positioning Amanda in Jonathan's office, the carefully orchestrated late nights that had transformed professional admiration into personal attraction, and the satisfaction of watching her son finally choose ambition over the sentimentality that had led him to marry a woman who wore discount store clothes to charity galas. The pharmaceutical company that acquired your patents is here to discuss terms, the attorney continued, and this time his words cut through Catherine's self-congratulation like ice water through champagne. But what made her freeze wasn't the mention of acquisition. It was seeing the pharmaceutical company's CEO enter the room wearing a maternity dress that looked strangely familiar. Elena walked to the front of the conference room with the measured pace of someone whose pregnancy made heels impractical, but her posture carried none of the defeated slump Catherine had been expecting from the daughter-in-law she'd successfully removed from her son's life. "Hello, Catherine," Elena said, and the use of her first name, without the respectful Mrs. Montgomery that Catherine had always demanded, was the first indication that the power dynamics in this room had shifted in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated. Jonathan's face went white as he recognized his ex-wife, but Amanda's confusion was almost comical as she looked between the pregnant woman at the front of the room and the presentation about her own qualifications still frozen on the screen behind her. "What is she doing here?" Catherine demanded, rising from her chair with the indignation of someone unaccustomed to being surprised in her own conference room. But Elena simply nodded to her attorney, who dimmed the lights and replaced Amanda's credentials with a different presentation, this one showing 3 years of financial records that revealed exactly how the Montgomery Cosmetics empire had been staying afloat. Each slide was a revelation that made Catherine's empire look less like a thriving business and more like a house of cards built on patent infringements, fraudulent investors, and loans that had been guaranteed by someone Catherine had spent 5 years calling that common girl who trapped my son. "I've been your primary creditor for 3 years, Elena said calmly, her hand resting on her belly in a gesture that reminded everyone in the room exactly what Catherine had been willing to sacrifice for social status. But what made Catherine sink back into her chair wasn't the financial revelation. It was seeing the documentation of every cruel comment, every humiliating family dinner, every moment when Catherine had used her power to make Elena feel worthless, while Elena had been quietly keeping Catherine's entire empire from bankruptcy. The screen showed text messages between Catherine and Jonathan, including the one from their anniversary where Catherine had written, "Serve the papers today. Pregnant women are too emotional to negotiate properly." Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood floors that had witnessed countless business victories for his family, but would now witness their complete destruction. But when he tried to speak, Amanda grabbed his arm with a grip that revealed she was doing calculations of her own, weighing the man she'd won against the empire she'd thought came with him. Catherine watched her son's face cycle through denial, understanding, and horror as he realized the woman he'd divorced on their anniversary had been the only thing preventing his family's financial collapse. But what hurt more than the betrayal was seeing the fear in his eyes as he looked at Amanda and recognized that she was already planning her exit strategy. "The patents you've been using belong to my pharmaceutical company," Elena continued, and each word was delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd been preparing this presentation for 3 years. But what Catherine heard beneath the professional tone was the echo of every dinner where she'd critiqued Elena's table manners, every charity event where she'd introduced Elena as my son's unfortunate choice, every family meeting where she'd made decisions about Elena's life without ever considering Elena might be making decisions about theirs. The financial projections appeared on screen next, showing that without Elena's patents and financial backing, the Montgomery Cosmetics empire was worth less than the legal fees they'd be facing for the fraud Catherine had committed while building her self-made success story. "You did this," Catherine whispered, but the accusation fell flat because everyone in the room could see the documentation proving that Catherine had orchestrated her own destruction through years of cruelty toward the one person who'd been protecting her, and what made it truly devastating was realizing that Elena hadn't acted out of revenge, but out of simple business sense. She'd withdrawn support not because Catherine had been cruel, but because Catherine's cruelty had finally made continuing the charade pointless. Jonathan collapsed back into his chair, his hand slipping from Amanda's grip as he understood that the honeymoon he'd planned, the wedding he'd scheduled, and the future he'd envisioned were all funded by credit cards connected to accounts his ex-wife controlled. "The wedding invitation was a mistake," Jonathan said, quietly, and for the first time since the divorce papers, his voice carried genuine emotion rather than calculated cruelty. But Elena simply smiled, the same gentle smile she'd worn through 5 years of marriage, the smile of someone who'd learned that silence was more powerful than confrontation. Catherine looked at her son holding the woman he'd chosen over his pregnant wife, both of them realizing simultaneously that they'd traded authentic love for social ambition, and discovered too late that the social standing they'd been chasing was built on the very foundation they'd been destroying. "I'll be attending the wedding," Elena said, gathering her documents with movements made awkward by her pregnancy but dignified by her complete control of the situation. But what she didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that her attendance wouldn't be as the humiliated ex-wife Catherine had been expecting to witness her own replacement, but as the creditor coming to collect on debts that couldn't be paid in money alone. The country club chapel was decorated with white roses and crystal chandeliers when Elena arrived, but what made her pause at the entrance wasn't the opulence her mother-in-law had orchestrated. It was seeing the guest list included every business associate who'd witnessed Catherine's cruelty toward her over 5 years of family events. The society photographer positioned near the altar was the same woman who'd been instructed to crop Elena out of family photos at company parties, but now her camera was pointed at the door where Elena stood in a custom maternity gown that cost more than the entire wedding budget, though no one in the room knew that yet. Catherine stood at the front of the chapel directing last-minute adjustments to Amanda's train with the precision of a general positioning troops, completely unaware that the enemy she'd been preparing to humiliate had already won the war. Amanda looked beautiful in the ivory gown that had required 3 fittings and cost $40,000. But what made Elena's heart ache wasn't jealousy. It was recognizing the desperation in Amanda's eyes as she clutched her bouquet with white knuckles that revealed she'd spent the 3 weeks since the lawyer's office meeting trying to convince herself this wedding was still worth attending. Jonathan stood at the altar in his custom tuxedo, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that looked confident from a distance but trembled visibly to anyone standing close enough to notice. And Elena wondered if he'd told Amanda the truth about their financial situation, or if he was hoping to make it to the honeymoon before she discovered the credit cards would be declined. "She actually came," Catherine whispered to her sister in the front row, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment of public humiliation for 3 weeks. But what she'd prepared was a speech about forgiveness and moving forward that would let everyone know Elena had been invited out of charity rather than obligation. The guests turned to stare as Elena walked down the aisle, their expressions ranging from pity to curiosity, but none of them recognized the quiet power in her measured steps, the walk of someone who owned the building they were standing in, though the property transfer wouldn't be public record until Monday morning. "Thank you for coming," Jonathan said, when Elena reached the 3rd row where an usher had positioned her, not in the family section where she'd sat for 5 years of weddings and christenings, but in the general guest area where distant cousins and business acquaintances were seated. His voice carried an apology he couldn't speak aloud, not with Amanda watching from the altar and his mother beaming with satisfaction at successfully orchestrating the social event that would erase his pregnant ex-wife from memory. But Elena saw the truth in his eyes. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He'd known since the lawyer's office meeting, and some part of him had been hoping she wouldn't actually come. The minister began the ceremony with words about new beginnings and second chances, but what made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats was remembering that the groom's first chance was currently 6 months pregnant, and sitting in the third row watching her replacement promise to love the man who'd served her divorce papers on their anniversary. Catherine's smile grew wider with each traditional vow, her satisfaction visible to everyone except Amanda, who was too focused on getting through the ceremony to notice her future mother-in-law's victory expression. But Elena noticed because she'd spent 5 years learning to read Catherine's moods as a survival mechanism in a family that had never wanted her. If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace, the minister intoned, and the traditional words that usually passed without incident hung in the air like a challenge no one expected to be accepted. But Elena rose from her seat with movements made deliberate by pregnancy weight and walked toward the altar with an envelope in her hand. The gasps from the guests were audible. Catherine's face transformed from satisfaction to fury in seconds, and Amanda's bouquet trembled as she watched her wedding become the spectacle she'd been trying to avoid since the lawyer's office revelation 3 weeks ago. "I have documentation the couple should see before proceeding," Elena said calmly, her voice carrying none of the emotion the guests were expecting from a pregnant ex-wife interrupting her former husband's wedding. But what made the minister step back wasn't her tone. It was seeing the legal firm's logo on the envelope she carried. Jonathan's face went gray as Elena approached, but he didn't move to stop her because they both knew this moment had been inevitable since the day he'd chosen his mother's approval over his wife's love, and some part of him, the part that remembered who he'd been before wealth had corrupted his priorities, understood he deserved whatever revelation was coming. "These are the financial statements you should have received before agreeing to marry," Elena said, handing the envelope to Amanda, whose hands shook as she broke the seal. But what Elena didn't say was that she'd spent 3 weeks debating whether to reveal this information publicly or privately, whether to humiliate them the way Catherine had humiliated her, or to offer the dignity she'd never received. Amanda's face changed as she read the first page, then the second, her perfect makeup unable to hide the realization that the billionaire she was marrying was actually $17 million in debt without Elena's continued financial support. But what made her look at Jonathan with betrayal rather than confusion was seeing the dates on the documents. He'd known about the debt before proposing, known about it when planning the wedding, known about it while she'd been telling her family about her upgrade from secretary to society wife. "You knew," Amanda whispered, and those 2 words carried more accusation than any lengthy speech could have delivered. But Jonathan couldn't respond because Catherine was now reading over Amanda's shoulder, and her expression had transformed from fury at Elena's interruption to horror at the revelation that her empire was collapsing. The guests leaned forward in their seats, desperate to understand what documents could stop a wedding in progress, but Elena had positioned herself to block their view. This revelation was for the couple and Catherine alone, at least for now. "The bankruptcy filing is scheduled for Monday," Elena continued, her voice still calm despite the chaos erupting at the altar. But what she didn't mention was that she'd paid the bankruptcy lawyers herself, because watching them struggle through debt would have been cruel to the child she carried, the child who would inherit their name even if she never inherited their love. Catherine tried to snatch the documents from Amanda, her carefully constructed social mask crumbling as she realized every guest at this wedding would soon know the truth about the Montgomery family fortune. But Amanda held firm because she was doing calculations that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the career she'd sacrificed to become Mrs. Montgomery. "The prenuptial agreement you signed last week is worthless," Elena added, looking directly at Amanda, whose eyes widened as she understood that the legal protection she'd negotiated, the agreement that would have given her $10 million if the marriage ended, was connected to assets that didn't exist. Jonathan reached for Amanda's hand, but she stepped back instinctively, her wedding dress rustling in the silence that had fallen over the chapel, and everyone present understood they were witnessing not just the end of a wedding, but the collapse of carefully constructed lies that had been holding together for years. "I'm keeping the ring," Amanda said finally, her voice steady despite the tears threatening her mascara. But what made Elena respect her in that moment was seeing Amanda choose self-preservation over the illusion of romance. The same choice Elena had made 5 years too late. Catherine sank into the front pew as the weight of social destruction settled over her, her sister placing a supportive hand on her shoulder while whispering questions about what was happening. But Catherine couldn't answer because she was watching 5 years of manipulation collapse in real time. Jonathan stood alone at the altar as Amanda walked back down the aisle she'd entered 10 minutes earlier, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. But when he looked at Elena, his expression carried something she hadn't expected, not anger or humiliation, but a profound regret that seemed to age him 10 years in seconds. The guests began whispering, their phones emerging from designer bags, despite the no photography policy, and Elena knew that by evening the story would be everywhere. Not the version Catherine had planned, where Elena was pitied and dismissed, but the truth about a family whose cruelty had finally consumed itself. "I loved you," Jonathan said quietly, the words meant only for Elena, though several nearby guests strained to hear. But what made Elena's hand move protectively to her belly was recognizing that he was using past tense, not because the love had died when he signed the divorce papers, but because he understood the version of himself she'd loved no longer existed. Catherine stood, then her social training kicking in as she tried to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond her management. But the guests were already leaving, and their departure was more devastating than any words Elena could have spoken. They were abandoning the Montgomery family not because of the financial collapse, but because Catherine's years of cruelty had finally been exposed as the desperate actions of someone whose empire was built on borrowed money and stolen patents. "The country club membership will be revoked by Tuesday," Elena said to Catherine, not as revenge but as simple fact, watching the older woman's face crumble as she realized the social standing she'd protected so viciously was evaporating. Catherine had spent 40 years building an empire based on appearance rather than substance, and what made it truly tragic was realizing she'd sacrificed her son's genuine happiness for a facade that had been collapsing all along, held up only by the daughter-in-law she'd spent 5 years trying to destroy. The chapel was nearly empty when Jonathan finally sank to his knees, but what made Elena's breath catch wasn't seeing her ex-husband broken at the altar where he should have been married. It was watching his mother remain seated in the front pew, still refusing to acknowledge the destruction her cruelty had caused, even as their world collapsed around them. The minister had retreated to the vestry with the practiced discretion of someone who'd witnessed family disasters before, but the handful of guests who remained were no longer pretending to look away, their phones recording every moment of the Montgomery family's public unraveling for social media posts that would define this story for years to come. "I didn't know," Jonathan said, his voice breaking on words that should have been spoken 3 weeks ago when he'd first seen the financial documents in the lawyer's office. But Elena understood he wasn't talking about the money. He was talking about her, about the woman he'd married in a college chapel 7 years ago, when neither of them had anything but dreams and student debt. His tuxedo was still perfect, his hair still styled with the care his mother had always demanded for public appearances, but his hands trembled against the marble floor as he finally understood what he'd traded for his mother's approval. "You knew enough," Elena replied, not with anger, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who'd spent 5 years watching the man she loved choose family obligation over personal integrity. But what surprised her was feeling tears on her own cheeks, not for the marriage she'd lost, but for the version of Jonathan that had died long before he'd signed the divorce papers. Catherine stood then, moving toward her son, with the instinct to protect that had been twisted over decades into something that destroyed rather than nurtured. But Elena stepped between them with a movement that was purely protective, not of Jonathan, but of the truth that needed to be spoken without interference. "I'm the Trillionaire's daughter," Elena said, and though Jonathan had known this since the lawyer's office meeting, hearing her speak it aloud in the chapel where they'd planned to renew their vows on their 10th anniversary made the reality undeniable. Catherine's face cycled through disbelief, understanding, and horror as she finally comprehended that every cruel comment about Elena being common, every humiliating family dinner where she'd critiqued Elena's manners, every social event where she'd positioned Elena as beneath their family status had been directed at someone whose net worth made their billions look like pocket change. "My father is Richard Chen," Elena continued, and the gasps from the remaining guests confirmed they recognized the name, the pharmaceutical magnate whose empire spanned 6 continents and whose daughter's identity had been protected so carefully that most people didn't know he had children. Jonathan looked up from the floor where he knelt, his eyes meeting Elena's with a question he couldn't voice, because asking, "Why didn't you tell me?" would reveal he'd never bothered to ask about her family beyond the surface-level story she'd provided when they met in graduate school. But Elena saw the question anyway and decided after 7 years of protecting him from consequences, he deserved the complete truth. "I wanted to know if you could love me without my father's money," Elena said, her hand moving to her belly where their daughter kicked in response to her elevated heart rate. But what made Jonathan's face crumble wasn't the admission that their entire marriage had been a test. It was realizing he'd failed so spectacularly that his ex-wife had spent 5 years documenting his failure while simultaneously keeping his family's empire from bankruptcy. Catherine tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she processed that the woman she'd spent years calling unworthy was actually far above them in every measure she claimed to value. But Elena wasn't finished because these revelations needed to be complete before she could finally walk away from the family that had never deserved her sacrifice. "I funded your mother's company for 3 years, Elena continued, and each word landed like a physical blow as Jonathan understood that every success his family had celebrated, every business victory his mother had claimed as proof of her superiority, had been possible only because Elena had been quietly providing the capital and connections that made expansion possible. The cosmetics launch in Europe that Catherine had called her greatest achievement had been funded by Elena's pharmaceutical contacts, and the patent portfolio that had allowed them to compete with major beauty corporations had been licensed from Elena's companies at rates so favorable they constituted charity. But Elena had maintained the illusion because she'd been hoping Jonathan would eventually choose their marriage over his mother's manipulation. "Why?" Jonathan whispered, and the single word contained 7 years of questions about why she'd stayed, why she'd helped, why she'd loved him, despite his family's cruelty. But Elena didn't have a simple answer, because the truth was complicated. She'd been young and hopeful and convinced that love could overcome family dysfunction if she just tried hard enough. Catherine sank back into the pew as the magnitude of her mistakes became undeniable, her carefully constructed worldview shattering as she realized she'd been insulting her own benefactor, destroying the one person who'd been protecting her legacy, and orchestrating the removal of a daughter-in-law whose connections and wealth had been sustaining everything Catherine claimed to have built herself. "The divorce papers you served on our anniversary freed me," Elena said, and for the first time since entering the chapel, her voice carried something beyond calm professionalism. It carried relief, the sound of someone who'd been trapped in a role they'd never wanted and had finally been released through the very cruelty meant to destroy them. Jonathan stood slowly, his knees unsteady, and reached for Elena's hand with the desperate hope of someone who'd just realized what he'd lost. But she stepped back because some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, no matter how sincere the regret, and their marriage had been burned so thoroughly that only ashes remained. "I'll support our daughter financially," Elena continued, her business tone returning as she outlined the terms of their new relationship with the precision of someone negotiating a contract rather than discussing a child. But what she didn't say, what Jonathan could see in her eyes, was that their daughter would know her father only as a cautionary tale about choosing social status over authentic love. Catherine tried one final time to assert control, standing and attempting to direct Elena toward a private conversation where she could negotiate terms or offer apologies, or do whatever damage control seemed possible. But Elena simply handed her a business card with her lawyer's contact information and turned toward the chapel door. "The building will be sold next month," Elena said as her final revelation, and the casual mention that she owned the country club where Catherine had spent 20 years positioning herself as social royalty was the perfect ending to a story about the consequences of measuring worth in superficial terms. Jonathan followed her down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty chapel. But he stopped at the door because even in his desperation, he understood that some mistakes were permanent, and serving divorce papers to your pregnant wife on your anniversary was the kind of choice that defined character rather than circumstance. "If you'd told me who you were," Jonathan began, but Elena cut him off because she'd spent 3 weeks since the lawyer's office meeting preparing for this exact conversation and knew exactly where his reasoning would lead. "Then you would have loved my father's money instead of me," Elena finished, and the truth of that statement hung between them like the ghost of the marriage they'd destroyed together, him through weakness and her through tests he'd never known he was taking. Catherine stood at the altar watching her son chase after the woman she'd spent years trying to remove from their family. And the irony of that image was almost poetic. The mother who'd orchestrated this destruction, now watching helplessly as her son experienced the natural consequences of choices she'd encouraged him to make. "Our daughter will know both sides of this story," Elena said as she reached the chapel exit, where her driver waited with the car. But what she meant was that their daughter would understand how her father had traded authentic love for social approval, and how her grandmother had valued reputation over relationships, until both had cost her everything that actually mattered. Jonathan nodded, his eyes red but his tears exhausted, and Elena felt the final connection between them dissolve like sugar in rain, sweet once but impossible to reconstruct once destroyed. The country club's parking lot was filled with departing guests, their conversations animated as they discussed the scandal they'd witnessed. But Elena noticed that none of them had stayed to support Catherine. The woman who'd spent decades cultivating social connections had discovered too late that relationships built on status rather than substance dissolved the moment the status disappeared. Her driver opened the car door and Elena lowered herself into the seat with the careful movements of late pregnancy. But before he closed the door, she looked back at the chapel where Jonathan still stood, watching her leave. "He's on his knees again," her driver observed quietly, and Elena turned to see Jonathan had collapsed once more, This time on the chapel steps where arriving guests should have been throwing rose petals but were instead stepping carefully around a broken man who'd finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. Catherine rushed to her son's side, her maternal instinct overwhelming her social training, but the image they created, mother and son clinging to each other amid the ruins of their empire, was less tragic than inevitable because people who built their lives on cruelty and status always eventually discovered that both were foundations made of sand. "Take me home," Elena said, and the word home meant the penthouse she'd purchased under her real name, not the apartment where she'd been living as a struggling abandoned wife, but the actual residence that matched her actual status as one of the wealthiest women in the world. Her daughter kicked again, strong and insistent, and Elena placed both hands on her belly as she imagined raising this child without the dysfunction that had defined her marriage, teaching her daughter that worth came from character rather than bank accounts, and ensuring that the cycle of cruelty that had destroyed Jonathan's family would end with her generation. The car pulled away from the country club as the sun set behind the building Elena owned, and in the rearview mirror she watched Jonathan and Catherine become smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely, not just from view but from the story of her life, where they'd occupied space they'd never deserved. Some people might call what happened revenge, but Elena understood it was simply consequence, the natural result of treating people as disposable when they turned out to be irreplaceable, and the price of choosing appearances over authenticity until the choice became permanent and the cost became unbearable.